Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating 8th grade curriculum that explores the mechanics of our planet. We're going to look at exactly how Earth's climate systems work and how this specific material views our role within them. Right off the bat, the lesson hooks us with Psalm 24:1, "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it." The curriculum uses this as a foundation to ensure that hearing the words climate change doesn't just evoke fear, but rather a profound sense of biblical stewardship. It really frames the whole topic around learning how to care for a masterpiece that was entrusted to humanity.
So, here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover the call to stewardship, decoding the carbon cycle, forces of climate change, taking action for balance, and finally, education rooted in morality.
All right, let's jump straight into part 1, the call to stewardship.
The material drives home this idea that God gave Earth as an incredible gift to be cared for. And if you think about it, studying weather and climate is basically like reading the instruction manual for creation. It argues that climate science is exactly what helps students become wise stewards, ensuring future generations are protected.
Which brings us to part 2, decoding the carbon cycle. So, what actually is the carbon cycle? Well, it's essentially the natural, ongoing movement of carbon between our atmosphere, plants, animals, oceans, and even rocks. Carbon is literally always on the move. And understanding this perfectly balanced flow is the absolute foundation for figuring out how the climate can eventually get disrupted.
Here's how that whole flow works. Step 1, you've got carbon just hanging out in the atmosphere. Then, step 2, plants swoop in and pull that carbon dioxide right out of the air using photosynthesis. Step 3 brings animals into the mix. When living creatures breathe out, bam, carbon goes back into the system. And finally, step 4, the Earth uses rocks and fossil fuels as this giant long-term storage vault for carbon. It really is a perfectly engineered loop.
Moving right along to part 3, forces of climate change.
Okay, so the big takeaway here is that Earth's climate is affected by two main forces: natural events and human activities. When that delicate natural carbon cycle gets thrown out of whack by either of these, we see real-world consequences, like melting glaciers or incredibly strong storms. On one side, we have natural events, like volcanoes, which can actually cool the Earth. And on the flip side, we have human activities, heavily reliant on fossil fuels, which are currently warming the Earth.
Let's look at a wild example of a natural event. Back in 1991, Mount Pinatubo erupted. This thing released an unbelievable amount of ash and gas straight up into the atmosphere. And get this, because all that material literally blocked out a chunk of the sun's rays, the entire planet temporarily cooled by about 1 degree Fahrenheit for a whole year. Talk about a powerful natural force temporarily shifting the climate balance, right? But then we have human impacts. Every single day, factories are burning coal, cars are burning oil, and huge electricity plants are powering our cities. The real issue here is that human activities are rapidly digging up all that deeply stored carbon we talked about earlier and pumping it straight back into the atmosphere as CO2. We're basically overloading the system way faster than nature can naturally absorb it.
So what do we do about it? Let's get into part 4, taking action for balance.
I want you to think about the number 48. Why? Because just one single mature tree can absorb around 48 pounds of carbon dioxide every single year. That is huge. Nature already has the built-in tools to fix the imbalance. We just have to support them.
So the curriculum gives students some incredibly practical, empowering ways to help. You can conserve energy right at home, literally just turning off the lights and using less electricity. You can plant trees, which, as we just learned, are basically little carbon-absorbing engines pulling 48 pounds a year. And of course, you can easily reduce your everyday waste. These are super simple actions, but they genuinely help the Earth rebalance its carbon cycle.
At this point, the curriculum actually hits pause for a quick homework review to test active recall. So test yourself real quick. First, what are the main parts of the carbon cycle? And second, how do humans increase carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? Take a second to think about it.
All right, got your answers? The carbon cycle moves between the atmosphere, plants, animals, oceans, and rocks. And as for how humans increase CO2, yep, primarily by burning fossil fuels. The review then ties the science right back to its spiritual anchor. Can you name a natural climate event? Why is planting trees such a good idea? And how exactly does Psalm 24:1 guide us?
Here's the breakdown. Volcanoes are your prime example of a powerful natural climate event. Trees are absolute rock stars because they actively absorb carbon dioxide. And Psalm 24:1, It grounds the whole lesson, reminding students that Earth is a gift, making caretaking both an environmental necessity and a biblical responsibility.
And that brings us to our final section, Part 5, Education Rooted in Morality. This part highlights a core philosophy of the Heroesmart Academy Godly Learners series, Education Without Morality Will Hurt. It asks a really profound question. I mean, what is the point of memorizing the carbon cycle and being highly educated if people just keep making choices that hurt creation? Science gives us the knowledge, but without a moral compass, that knowledge doesn't just magically turn into positive change.
To keep students from feeling, totally overwhelmed by all these climate impacts, the lesson points to Romans 8:6-7, which promises peace of mind to everyone who keeps their mind spiritual. It makes the case that looking at complex, sometimes scary science through a spiritual lens actually replaces anxiety with a deep sense of purpose. It tells students, hey, you're working alongside God to care for the earth.
So, the curriculum wraps everything up with this powerful final thought. Science brilliantly shows us exactly how the Earth works, but things like stewardship, humility, and wisdom, those are what must guide how we protect it. Education is presented as a tool, and morality dictates how we actually use that tool in the real world.
The lesson leaves its students with one final incredibly provocative question. Now that you understand the carbon cycle, the real-world impacts, and the solutions, will you use your education to become a wise steward of the world you've been given? Something to think about. Thanks so much for joining me on The Explainer today, and we'll catch you next time.